Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking on and how to configure and install DHCP server on a Windows Server 2019 operating system. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and it is used to give out IP addresses on a network. On a home network, which is connected to a traditional typical broadband, the DHCP server normally would be on a router, and normally would not be required because it's on the router and it's enabled on the router. However, if we're setting up a network and and you want to manage it yourself on a Windows server, then this is how to install it on a Windows Server 2019. On a Windows Server 2016 and 2012, it's done in the same way. So first we log into Windows Server 2019 or whichever operating system you're logging into. As you can see, this is Windows Server 2019 Standard Edition. In Standard Edition and in the Data Center Edition, it's no different. The installation is done in the same way. So we go to Server Manager, you can just click don't show in this message on this dialog box, and as per our other videos, what we do is we add the role, and we just click on add roles and features, and we click next, and we click next again, and we pretty much go down to server roles, and it's a server role, is what we want to add. So here we want to add the server role, and we select DHCP, and it asks you, do you want to add the feature, and we click add feature. Include management tools, then yes, you would include the management tool, which will give you the interface to at the MMC Management Console Windows interface will be added. If you were managing it remotely from another server, you typically don't need it on the server. In which case you can uncheck that because it will install the admin console for it. But we want to add the feature, so we click add feature, and as that's all we're adding, we click next, next, and we click on install. And once the feature is added, it will install the server feature, in which, like I said, in this instance is Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or known typically as DHCP server. And as indicated, what the responsibility for the server is to issue IP addresses to all the workstations on the network. And there's a whole load of features, advanced features, which can be configured as part of the setup. So now that this the features installed, we click close, and we can close the server manager, and now we launch the console, which is from the control panel, and we're going to administrative tools, and in there we'll see this appear, the DHCP server. Now if you had not checked that checkbox, then this wouldn't appear. It's not that we still can't connect to it, because the server is installed, except that you can't connect. This feature won't be there, so you need to snap in an MMC console. But as we've installed it, we launch it, Um, that will essentially launch, and the server name will be displayed in the list. Now, um, at this stage, the installation has been completed successfully and it's installed. No server reboot is required for this after installation, but we now do need to configure it. So whilst the server is installed, it's not going to give out any IP addresses. It's not going to work because this needs to be configured. Now, going forward, obviously, everybody's used to the IPv4, which is Internet Protocol version 4. However, we can now also configure IPv6 addresses in the DHCP. However, for this video, we're not going to be configuring IPv6 because that's a very more advanced, and pretty much nobody's using it at the moment. IPv6, only large organizations are using it. So we will leave that for the moment, and we will concentrate on IPv4. Here, before we start, it's presumed we know what IP addresses we need, and which network this is being configured for. So it is essential that we know which network this is being configured for and what IP addresses are going to be used. Um, so with this in mind, typically the IP addresses that would be configured would be the addresses that would be configured would be the private IP address ranges. These typically begin 192.168 range or 10.0 range. I will be uploading a video detailing the IPv4 ranges and private address ranging and how to subnet these, but that would be a separate video. Uh, so here we know what IP address range we're adding, the private IP address range. So what we'll do is go ahead and configure that. So you go into server options and you right click on server options and select configure options. Here we're going to select what it is that we want to configure. So we want to configure name servers. So we want to specify what name servers are going to be used. So as well as issuing IP addresses, it also issues router and name server. So we want to be able to issue router, name servers, actually instead of name servers we can select DNS servers more accurately. Um, and th and there are various other things that you can select in here, but we don't need those. Like time server would be well, actually I can go through this with you. Time server is it basically so if you want to use different time servers depending on the time of day, you can assign this time server. However, we're going to be using a single time server, so we don't need to assign pretty much anything else. Like I said, we've selected DNS server. So here we're going to configure this. So here we're going to configure what IP address ranges, what the DNS server IP address ranges are going to be. So here, for example, if you had a home broadband router, that typically would be sitting on 192.168.1.1, let's say. If that was the case, you could add that in. And that essentially would be uh, configured. Actually, we're going to be removing that, but that's all you need to do is add in the items that you want to configure. Once you've added all the items, you press apply and OK. Right, here is the most important thing, is the scope. So you, instead of clicking on that, you click on the top part where it says IPv4, you right click and you choose scope. Now this is essentially where you're going to configure what IP address ranges you need. The other parts which are below this, which are complement the main range. Here is what the main range is. So you can give it a name. The name doesn't really matter. This is only for to help you identify what the scope is for. So you can just give it the IP address. Normally I would just give it the IP address that we want to use. So we 192.168. For example, .2.1 is what we want to use. So 2.0 is the subnet with /24. /24 just indicates it's a class C IP address. Even if you don't do that, it doesn't matter. It will be fine. You know it's the whole subnet, which is the whole of the 0 to 255 would be the class C there. So we press next. We don't need to give it a description here. You can if you wanted to make it in more detail, but for your information, or you wanted to specify something, or the person that created it, or whatever, if there was a requirement, you could add some details in there. But we don't need to do that for this training session, so we will click next. Now here is where you're going to start the IP address range from. So if you're using the IP address range that I have indicated here, you could substitute the IP address range 92.168.2.0. So here typically the router would be 192.168.0. Either 1 or it will be 254. BT routers generally tend to be 254. If you're using a different one, it might be 1. So we will just say, or you're setting your own IP address range, you can change the router's IP address range to suit your requirements. So you could say, for example, 2.254, and that is absolutely fine. And as is 2.1, if that's whatever the router's IP address is. So we know this is the router IP address. Router. And what else you would need to configure is where you want, what range your IP address range is going to be within. So where do you want the first IP address issued to start from? So you've got a whole range 254 from 0 to 25. It's actually 255, but the last IP address 255 is a broadcast address, and it shouldn't really be used on a network, because it will get a lot of spam coming through to it, because everything broadcasts to that IP address. So that is typically never used, and the last address is 254. So that's what we've given to the router in this instance. So we want to say and identify which IP address ranges we want to use. So we want to leave some for server, and if you've only got a requirement for 10-15 IP addresses, because you've got 10-15 users, you can still use a larger range than that. So for example, we want to use 192.168.2. Let's say 2.11 to 99. So that will be 192.168. Oops, sorry. 192.168.2.99. So that does give you essentially almost 80 IP addresses from 11 to 99 is how many IP addresses you have. So it's worth recording this information so you know what your IP address ranges are. And in any case, you need to do a spreadsheet to be able to record all your IP address ranges, what the router is, what you're assigned to, your public IP addresses. Here we're only concerned with the private IP address ranges. So the first IP address in the range is going to be 192.168.2.254, and sorry, it's going to be 2.11. We've already indicated that. And the last IP address is going to be 192.168.2.99. You can make it up to 200 if you wanted, and you still got 50 to go, which you can assign to IP. The first 10 from 1 to 10, because if the root is 54, so you can't use 54. Or if the router was 1, you couldn't use 1. So one's already assigned to the router, or 54, whichever you've assigned, that's already assigned. That can't be used. So you have to make sure the IP address ranges are not, for example, if you've got servers and they've already been assigned IP addresses, you're better off keeping them either on low numbers between 2 and 10, because your IP address range for the DHCP starts from 11 to 99. So you could make the server IP address 100, or you could say, you know what, I'm going to leave this to 199, and my server address is going to start from 200, and that's absolutely fine. If you want to do that, you can do that, and you still got a large range of IP addresses. You can actually increase that, because that's as you can see, the length here is 24 bit. So that's going to give you it's a /24, which is 255 IP addresses. We can change the subnet mask and make it a larger range if we wanted to, but in this instance, for average person, 255 IP addresses or a class C is more than sufficient. So we're going to leave that with the original plan, which was 99, which we've documented, and we're going to press next. So the subnet mask on the network is going to be 255.255.255.0, and that corresponds to the class C IP address subnet mask. Click next. Here you can add exclusions, but because we're building the exclusions in ourselves, so if you had IP addresses that you wanted to exclude from the DHCP server so that the DHCP server cannot give those IP addresses, you put the exclusion list here. So if you wanted to, for example, use the whole from 2 to 254, you could do that, and you could exclude them here, and that's absolutely fine as well. You can do that, but my own preference is to exclude them myself, so I'm controlling it myself. So I normally assign IP address range that I know I want to assign, and I exclude them what I don't want to exclude myself, so that I can just assign them myself. So it doesn't even come into the equation because they're totally out. But even excluding them here will work absolutely fine, and those are IP addresses. So if you wanted to exclude 50 to 60 for whatever reason, you can add the exclusion in. So you've got this whole IP address range, but let's say there's a requirement that you need to exclude an IP address, so that DHCP server cannot give it out. Let's say 2.50, 192.162.50. You can actually say, you know what, I'm going to exclude 192.168.50, and the end IP address could be 50, and you can click add. So it'll exclude that single IP address. In this instance, we don't want to exclude anything, and we click next. Lease duration. So lease, like you IP addresses, they're on lease. So it's like you rent a flat, it's on lease. After a certain amount of lease, you have to renew the lease. Otherwise, you have to give it back. Similarly, the IP addresses from DHCP are issued to clients, i.e. the workstations that you've got on your network on a lease. After the lease expires, the server typically asks for the workstation will ask the DHCP server for a new IP address, which does not take long. So even if it's a short time, it makes no difference. It will just refresh the IP. There might actually be a requirement for yourselves to renew the IP address every hour. So you would reduce the lease to 1 hour if that was the instance, or 1 day. Here the lease is by default on 8 days because there's normally never a reason to expire the IP address after a certain time. So we'll leave it will always be on a lease. You can't make it unlimited because the whole purpose of DHCP that the IP address is issued on a lease. So here we'll leave it to the default because we're not really interested in manage that. But like I said, if you wanted to reduce it to hours or minutes, and then that would force the workstation to go and ask for a new IP from the DHCP server. So if there was a requirement, then that's when you would configure it. Otherwise, leave it as default. 8 days is fine. Next, it's going to ask you do you want to configure DHCP option for the scope now? You want to click yes, I want to configure. Click next. So here you need to, because the IP address, once it issues the IP address, the internet etc. won't work unless you also say what the default gateway is or what the router's IP address is. So in this instance, our internet gateway out will be 192, which we've already indicated here as the router, which is also the internet gateway out, which is 192.168.2.254, and we clicked add. So as well as giving an IP address out, it will also give out the router address as well. Click next. Parent domain. So for example, normally this will be your network domain. So your network, if you look at my other videos, we've configured VLANs and IP addressing and DNS names, and the network has to have a name. So if you join a network, the network has to be given a name. So for example, let's say it was Microsoft.local, then that's what you would put down, Microsoft local, or it was softprog.local, then that's what you would say. You would say softprog.local. Then you'd give the IP addresses of the DNS servers. So these DNS servers are the servers that you need to look up. We've already put earlier on. We put in 192.168.1.1. If that was your DNS server, then you would put that. If your DNS server was, but for that example, this is actually wrong, so we'll remove it because the DNS server for that would be the router normally, and it would be this one, 192.168.2.254 is what would go in here. But if you were running your own Windows Server Active Directory, then you would not want to use that IP address. You would want to use the server's IP. So as you can see, this server's IP address is 192.168.1.150. It's not the same subnet, I agree, but that's only because 192.168.1.150, and because this is going to change into a different subnet. This server, we're going to enter into a different subnet, so I'll make it 2.150. So if the DNS server was set up on this server, when this server issues the IP address, it will /01 is the name of the server. Or you can actually look it up, but that's actually incorrect name, so we will leave that out. If you knew the name but you didn't know the IP address, you could actually type it here and click resolve, and it'll find the IP address out. But as we know what the IP address is, we're going to do it by IP 192.168.192.168. The reason why that other IP address came out, there's a reason for it, and actually let me, for out of interest, show you why that happened. /01 is the name of the server, and it came up with a 169 address. Now 169 address is assigned automatically when the server cannot find a network, because this server is a temporary server. It's not been connected. That NIC which is resolving is not being connected to any network, so that's why it's giving an IP address of 19 beginning 169. but that doesn't matter if the NIC's not connected because it will be in the future. So we can give this address as 192 because we know it, 192.168.2.2 uh, dot 2 dot, it's actually going to, this server address is going to be 2.200. So we'll give it an IP address of 2.200 because we know that's what the DNS server's IP address will be once it's configured. We click next. Now it's asking for WINS. Now WINS is an old lookup system prior to Windows Server 2000, that long ago. WINS is now not really used. If you were using WINS in your network, then you need to specify it here. But any modern networks from or any network that you're setting up new, or any more newer networks, will not be using WINS at all. So you can just press next on that. I'm not apart from if there's a requirement, you don't need to configure this. Click next. Activate scope. So what does that mean is clients can obtain IP addresses leases only if a scope is activated. Yeah. So this means that if I say no, I will activate later, that means the scope will not be activated at this moment. If you know you are ready to go live with this, then click yes and click next. If you're not yet ready to go live with it, like we're not in this instance, I will click no for the moment. The reason being is there's another server running which is using a DHCP already, and if I activate this scope, then the other server is issuing IP addresses, and this server will start issuing IP addresses as well to the network. It will actually start issuing network addresses. Even though I've said earlier on, this server actually cannot, because it's not connected to the NIC. But the point is, we cannot take that risk because the server we will be connected to the server to the NIC in due course, and as soon as we plug in the cable, it will start issuing IP addresses. We'll have two DHCP servers on the network issuing IP addresses, and that causes a whole load of problems. So I would advise extreme caution when you're ready to go live with DHCP server. So if you've got a router on your network, like a BT router or any ISP that you got, they provide you with a router, then that router will be issuing IP addresses. You need to go into the configuration, into admin portal or console for that router, and then switch off the DHCP server. If you want to be using your own Windows DNS server and DHCP server, then you need to switch the DHCP server off on that. Otherwise it will conflict and will cause massive problems, because you have double IP addresses being issued, and in some cases you might even have the same IP issued to two machines, which will render them both as not workable on the network, and you will not be able to work out why this is not working. It works sometimes, it doesn't work sometimes. The internet works sometimes, I can get to the network sometimes, and then and a few hours later or 8 hours later is what the scope is, depending on the scope of the other router. It asks for another IP address. It might get it from this server, so that can cause big problems. I advise extreme caution when configuring it. So we're going to click next for the moment because we're not ready to go live with this yet, and you click finish. Now you'll see here that the scope is now become available. I'll maximize this. The scope has now become available, and this server is now configured with the pool, which is there 192.168.2. beginning 2.11 and ending 2.99. Address lease is fine. Reservation, we don't have any reservations. Reservations are going to be IP addresses that you want to reserve that the DHCP server cannot send out. Here we're going to add the router, which we know. So when the IP address is given out, it also sends out what the router is, what the DNS servers are. So to give an example on this, if we go to ipconfig, we can see that this server actually does not have IP address ranges given out. So the NIC is actually, like I said, it's actually not configured. Uh, so we will ignore that for the moment. But when the router gives the IP address, it'll give out this, which you need, and the DNS server, which you also need to look up, items on the internet, as well as within your own network. Please refer to my DNS video to better understand DNS. Thanks for viewing today's video, and I will come back with another video in the near future. Thank you.